The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday night in 2006, a relentless, drumming sound against the red roof of the Pizza Hut. Inside, the world was warm and smelled of baking dough and cheap pepperoni. It was a familiar smell, a comforting one for the small town of Harmony Creek. This was the place you went after a Little League game, the place you took a first date when you were 16 and fumbling with car keys. It was a place of simple joys, of checkered tablecloths and sticky soda spills. Nothing truly bad was supposed to happen here. The air hummed with the low chatter of families and the clatter of silverware against ceramic plates, a mundane symphony of a town at peace with itself. Kayla Thomas wiped down a table, her movements practiced and efficient. A single mother, she worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over her son's head, and the weariness showed in the faint lines around her eyes. But she always had a smile for the customers, a genuine warmth that made people feel seen. Tonight, she was thinking about her son's upcoming birthday, mentally calculating if she could afford the bicycle he wanted so badly. Across the room, Tyler James laughed with his friends, his varsity jacket slung over the back of his chair. He was the town's golden boy, the high school quarterback with a scholarship offer and a future as bright as the stadium lights he played under. He was just grabbing a pizza before heading home, another ordinary act in an ordinary life. The bell above the door chimed, but no one paid it much mind. It was just another customer seeking refuge from the storm, another hungry mouth to feed. The rain outside seemed to intensify, lashing against the windows as if trying to get in, to warn them. The clock on the wall ticked past 9, its hands moving with an indifferent slowness. Each second that passed was another second of innocence, another moment before the world tilted on its axis and spun into chaos. No one knew they were standing on the precipice of a memory that would haunt Harmony Creek for years, a stain that soap and water could never wash away from the linoleum floors. Outside, in a car parked just down the street, Cameron Reed waited for Tyler. He was supposed to give him a ride home. He fiddled with the radio, trying to find a clear station through the static of the storm. He was impatient, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, a typical teenager annoyed at waiting for his friend. He thought about the game on Friday, about a history test he hadn't studied for. He was wrapped up in the small, inconsequential dramas of youth, completely unaware that in a few short minutes, his life and the life of his town would be irrevocably fractured. The Pizza Hut, with its warm, inviting glow, was about to become a tomb. The 2 figures who entered were not there for pizza. They wore dark hoodies and ski masks, their shapes indistinct and menacing against the cheerful backdrop of the restaurant. A collective gasp rippled through the room as a gun was raised, its metallic gleam catching the fluorescent light. The easy chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The air, once filled with the scent of garlic bread, now tasted of fear. One of the men barked orders, his voice rough and distorted by the fabric covering his face. "Wallets and phones on the table, now!" The demand was a tear in the fabric of the ordinary, a violent intrusion into a place that was supposed to be safe. Kayla Thomas, ever the protector, moved slowly, trying to shield a young family cowering in a nearby booth. She spoke in a low, calming voice, urging everyone to comply, to just give them what they wanted so they would leave. Tyler James, however, was not built for passivity. He was a leader on the field, and in that moment he felt the same instinct to protect his team, his people. He stood up slowly, his hands raised. "Just take the money and go," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt." It was a brave thing to do. It was a foolish thing to do. It was the last thing he would ever do. The sharp crack of a gunshot was deafening in the small space. It was a sound that didn't belong, a percussive blast that shattered more than just the tense silence. Kayla screamed. Another shot followed, and then another. Chaos erupted. Patrons scrambled under tables, their bodies trembling, their minds struggling to process the horror unfolding before them. It was a whirlwind of screams, of shattering glass as a stray bullet hit a window, of the sickeningly metallic smell of blood filling the air. The robbers, panicked by their own violence, grabbed the cash drawer and fled into the stormy night, leaving behind a scene of carnage and devastation. When the sirens finally arrived, their wails cutting through the rain, they found a tableau of tragedy. Kayla Thomas lay near the counter, her life bleeding out onto the checkered floor. Tyler James was gone, his bright future extinguished in an instant of senseless violence. The survivors sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a trauma that would never fully fade. Outside in his car, Cameron Reed heard the sirens and saw the flashing lights. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled in his stomach. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that something terrible had happened to his best friend. The night had stolen more than just money. It had stolen lives, innocence, and a town's sense of security. Cameron Reed stood by Tyler's grave, the manicured grass still fresh and raw. The sky was a dull, unforgiving gray, mirroring the emptiness that had hollowed out his chest. He was 17, an age when life was supposed to be about possibilities, not finalities. He watched as people offered condolences to Tyler's parents, their words like soft, useless cotton balls against a gaping wound. He couldn't cry. The grief was too big, too sharp. It was a physical thing, a stone in his gut that made it hard to breathe. He remembered waiting in the car, the stupid song on the radio, the impatience. He replayed the minutes, the seconds, wondering what he could have done differently, a futile exercise in self-torture. In the weeks that followed, Harmony Creek was a town draped in mourning. Black ribbons were tied to mailboxes and storefronts. The Pizza Hut remained closed, a dark and silent monument to the tragedy. The police investigation was swift at first. They had eyewitnesses, shell casings, a general description of the assailants. But the leads dried up as quickly as they appeared. The masked faces offered no identity, and the fear that gripped the witnesses made their memories foggy and unreliable. Cameron watched the news reports, listened to the whispers, and felt a bitter anger begin to curdle alongside his grief. They were getting away with it. The people who had stolen his best friend were just gone. He made a promise at that graveside, a silent vow that only he and the cold earth could hear. He promised Tyler that he would not let him be forgotten. He promised that he would find the people who did this, no matter how long it took. It was a heavy promise for a teenager to make, a burden he wasn't equipped to carry, but it was the only thing that made sense. It became his anchor in a sea of sorrow, the one solid thing he could hold on to when everything else had been washed away. This promise would define the man he was to become, shaping his choices, his career, his entire life. It was a debt he felt he owed, a score that had to be settled. The years began to pass. High school ended. Cameron left Harmony Creek for college, then the police academy. But the promise followed him. It was there in the quiet moments before sleep, in the faces of victims he met on the job. He carried the ghost of Tyler with him, a constant nagging presence that reminded him of his unfinished business. The town of Harmony Creek slowly began to heal, or at least to scar over. The Pizza Hut eventually reopened. New families moved in. The story of the robbery became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to teenagers. But for Cameron, it was not a story. It was a raw, open wound that refused to close. 16 years later, in the summer of 2022, Cameron Reed returned to Harmony Creek. He was no longer the lanky, grief-stricken teenager. He was a man forged by his promise, his jaw set with a quiet determination. He wore the uniform of the town's new police chief, a position he had worked tirelessly to attain. For him, the badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a tool. It was the key that would unlock the door to a past that others had sealed shut. His return was met with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Some saw him as a hometown hero. Others, particularly those in the old guard of local law enforcement, saw him as a threat to the comfortable quiet they had cultivated. His first official act as chief was to walk into the records room and pull the file for the 2006 Pizza Hut murders. The folder was thick with dust, its contents yellowed and brittle with age. Case number 06-117, cold, inactive. To everyone else, it was a relic of a painful past, a tragedy best left undisturbed. To Cameron, it was a living, breathing thing. He spread the contents across his desk, faded crime scene photos, witness statements filled with contradictions, dead-end leads. He could feel the weight of those 16 years, the missed opportunities, the justice denied. He was not just a police chief reviewing a case, he was a boy looking for his friend. The resistance came almost immediately. The mayor, a man who prized civic peace above all else, cautioned him against reopening old wounds. The previous chief, now retired but still influential, told him to let it go. "We did everything we could, son," he said, his tone dismissive. "Sometimes you just don't get the win." They saw it as a waste of resources, a quixotic quest that could only stir up pain and distrust. They didn't understand that for Cameron, this was not about a win. It was about a promise. It was about Kayla Thomas, who died trying to protect others, and Tyler James, whose future was stolen for the contents of a cash register. Cameron refused to back down. He stood his ground in town hall meetings and in private conversations, his voice calm but unyielding. He argued that justice doesn't have an expiration date. He insisted that the victims and their families deserved more than a dusty file and a collective shrug. His crusade was a lonely one at first. He was fighting against institutional inertia and the town's deep-seated desire to forget, but his determination was a force of nature fueled by 16 years of unresolved grief and a singular, unwavering purpose. He would find the truth, even if he had to tear the town apart to do it. Cameron knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a fresh pair of eyes, someone not clouded by the town's history or its politics. He found that in Detective Rachel Holloway, a sharp, methodical investigator he recruited from a larger city department. She was an outsider, immune to the subtle pressures of Harmony Creek's social web. Rachel was initially skeptical, seeing the case as a long shot, a statistical improbability. But Cameron's conviction was contagious. She saw the fire in his eyes, the personal stake that went beyond professional duty, and she agreed to help him dig up the ghosts of 2006. Their first step was to re-examine every piece of physical evidence, what little of it remained. They spent long hours in the sterile environment of the evidence locker, poring over sealed bags containing shell casings, fibers, and a single, smudged fingerprint on a piece of broken glass that had never been successfully matched. The original investigation had been hampered by the technology of the time. Cameron and Rachel hoped that new forensic techniques could reveal what was previously hidden. They sent everything to the state crime lab for retesting, a small flicker of hope in the vast darkness of the cold case. While they waited for the lab results, Rachel began the painstaking process of re-interviewing every witness. 16 years was a long time. Memories fade, details blur, and life moves on. Some witnesses had moved away, others had passed away. Those who remained were reluctant to revisit the trauma. Rachel, however, was patient and empathetic. She didn't push. She listened. She noticed inconsistencies between the original 2006 statements and what people were telling her now. It wasn't that they were lying, but that the passage of time had allowed certain buried details to surface, small things that seemed insignificant then but might be crucial now. One interview with a former waitress who had been a teenager at the time yielded a peculiar detail. "I always thought it was weird," she told Rachel. "One of them had a limp. Not a big one, just a slight drag in his left foot. I told the first detective, but I don't think he wrote it down. He was so focused on their height and what they were wearing." Rachel checked the original report. There was no mention of a limp. It was a tiny crack in the foundation of the old investigation, a sign that things had been missed, that corners had been cut. It was the first solid piece of new information they had, a thread to pull in a tapestry of old secrets. The breakthrough they desperately needed came from an unexpected place. While sorting through Kayla Thomas's personal effects, which had been returned to her family and then given to Cameron, he found her old cell phone. It was a relic from 2006, a clunky flip phone that seemed ancient by modern standards. He didn't expect to find anything, assuming it had been wiped clean or was simply dead. But on a whim, he found a compatible charger online and plugged it in. After a few hours, miraculously, the small screen flickered to life. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary pass in the final seconds of the game. He navigated the phone's simple menu, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. He found the voicemail inbox. Most of the messages were mundane, a reminder from the dentist, a call from her son's school. But there was one message, received at 9:04 p.m. on the night of the murders. It had been left just moments before the robbery began. The caller hadn't left a message, but the phone had recorded 30 seconds of background noise from the restaurant before the call disconnected. It was an accidental dial, a pocket dial from someone inside the Pizza Hut. Cameron and Rachel listened to the recording in the dead silence of his office. The audio was muffled, filled with static, but it was there. They could hear the low hum of conversation, the clatter of a plate, and then, faintly, a voice. It was a young man's voice speaking to someone nearby. He said, "Don't worry. Mark will handle the register. Just keep everyone calm." The voice was casual, almost nonchalant. It wasn't one of the robbers. It was someone in the restaurant. Someone who knew one of the robbers by name. The name Mark had never appeared anywhere in the original case file. They spent the next week using audio enhancement software to clean up the recording, isolating the voice and filtering out the background noise. The result was a clearer, though still distorted soundbite. It was a ghost voice, a fragment of the past reaching out across 16 years. This was more than a limp. This was a name. It was the key. They now knew that at least one of the killers was named Mark and that he had an accomplice who was inside the Pizza Hut, posing as a customer, before the violence ever started. The case, once frozen in time, had suddenly, violently, thawed. The name Mark was their Rosetta Stone. Armed with this new information, Cameron and Rachel began to cross-reference the name with every person known to be in the restaurant that night, as well as their known associates from 2006. They built a sprawling web of connections on a whiteboard in Cameron's office, a messy constellation of names, faces, and potential links. The town of Harmony Creek wasn't that big. Secrets were hard to keep, but memories were easy to bury. They were looking for a Mark who would have been in his late teens or early 20s in 2006, someone who might have had a reason to be desperate for money. Their investigation led them to Mark Renner, a man who now owned a local construction business. In 2006, he was a high school dropout with a string of petty crimes to his name, but nothing that had ever put him on the radar for the murders. He had been questioned briefly back then, but he had an alibi. He claimed he was homesick. What was more interesting, however, was his best friend at the time, a quiet, unassuming boy named David Miller. David Miller had been in the Pizza Hut that night, sitting in a booth by himself. He was listed as a witness. He was the one who had accidentally dialed Kayla's phone. Rachel pulled David Miller's original witness statement. It was brief, vague, and filled with platitudes about how scared he was. He claimed he saw nothing useful, but now, his presence there seemed sinister, not coincidental. They ran a background check on David and found something the original investigators had missed or dismissed. In 2007, just months after the murders, David Miller had enlisted in the Army. During his physical, a doctor had noted a slight permanent injury to his left leg from a childhood accident, an injury that caused a subtle but noticeable limp. The detail from the waitress clicked into place. David was the second robber. The pieces were falling together, forming a picture that was both horrifying and deeply sad. These weren't hardened criminals from out of town. They were local boys. They were people who had lived among their victims, who had likely attended the candlelight vigils and nodded along with the town's shared grief. Cameron felt a cold sickness wash over him. The monsters weren't strangers who had invaded their peaceful town. The monsters had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, their faces familiar and trusted. The truth was not just a matter of justice. It was a betrayal that cut to the very heart of the community. Bringing in David Miller and Mark Renner for questioning required a delicate touch. Cameron knew that a direct accusation would only be met with denial. He decided to separate them, to let the weight of 16 years of lies press down on each man individually. Rachel took David into one interrogation room while Cameron sat across from Mark in another. The air in both rooms was thick with unspoken history. Mark, now a respected business owner with a family, was arrogant at first, dismissing the questions as a waste of his time. He was a pillar of the community now, not some troubled kid. Cameron let him talk, let him build his own cage of self-importance. Then he played the audio recording. He watched Mark's face as the ghostly voice of his friend David filled the small room. "Don't worry, Mark will handle the register." The confidence drained from Mark's eyes, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. His facade crumbled. Cameron leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "We know, Mark. We know you were there. We know David was with you. It's over." Mark's denial was weak, his lies transparent. The lie he had lived for 16 years had finally caught up to him. Meanwhile, in the other room, Rachel took a different approach with David Miller. She spoke to him about his military service, about the limp he had tried to hide. She talked about Kayla Thomas and her young son, about Tyler James and his stolen future. She didn't accuse him. She painted a picture of the lives that were shattered. David, a man who had lived with his guilt in silence, began to break. The tough exterior he had built over the years cracked under the pressure of Rachel's quiet empathy. His shoulders slumped and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. The confession, when it came, was a torrent. David admitted everything. He explained that they were desperate for money to pay off a drug debt. It was supposed to be a simple robbery, in and out. No one was supposed to get hurt. But Tyler James had stood up to them and Mark had panicked. He fired the gun. Kayla Thomas had screamed, and he, David, had fired his own weapon in a blind panic. It was a story of youthful stupidity and desperation that had spiraled into a nightmare. He had carried that guilt every single day for 16 years. The unmasking was complete, revealing not monsters, but flawed, weak men who had made a terrible choice and hidden from it ever since. The news of the arrest sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The revelation that the killers were not faceless strangers but two of their own was a profound betrayal. Mark Renner, the man who sponsored Little League teams. David Miller, the quiet veteran. The town was forced to look at itself, to question the faces they saw every day at the grocery store and the post office. The trial was a somber affair, a public airing of a wound the town had tried so hard to forget. Cameron Reed sat in the courtroom every day, a silent observer watching his promise being fulfilled. He wasn't there as the police chief. He was there for Tyler. The evidence was overwhelming. The audio recording, the forensic link to David's limp. And finally, David's full confession, which implicated Mark as the one who fired the first shot. Mark Renner was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. David Miller, in exchange for his testimony, was convicted of second-degree murder. Justice, delayed for 16 years, had finally been served. But there was no sense of celebration, no feeling of victory. There was only a quiet, heavy sense of resolution, the closing of a chapter that had remained painfully open for far too long. The verdict brought closure, but it could not bring back the dead. A week after the trial, the town gathered in the small park near the courthouse. A new memorial bench had been installed bearing 2 names engraved in a simple bronze plaque, Kayla Thomas and Tyler James. It sat facing the setting sun, a permanent tribute to the lives lost. Kayla's son, now a young man himself, spoke briefly, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked Cameron for never giving up. Tyler's parents stood beside Cameron, their hands on his shoulders, their gratitude expressed in a silence that was more powerful than words. The community stood together, their shared grief now layered with a shared understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass, Cameron Reed stood before the bench. He felt the weight of his promise finally lift from his shoulders, replaced by a profound and aching sadness. The quest for justice had been his life's work, a fire that had driven him for nearly 2 decades. Now that it was over, there was an emptiness. But there was also hope. He had proven that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can be brought into the light. He had shown his town that memory is a duty, and that fighting for what is right is a battle worth waging, no matter how many years it takes. The scars would remain, but Harmony Creek could finally, truly begin to heal.